Dating back to the ancient Olympics, home court advantage has always been a part of sports competition. But does home court advantage actually exist? And if it does, to what extent does it actually matter? Well, unfortunately, I can't answer that question because every sports league is constructed differently. However, I can answer that question as it pertains to the National Basketball Association. Coming up in this video. What's up guys, my name is Mark and we'll start off this video by first answering the simpler question, which is, throughout NBA history, has there actually been a significant home court advantage? In other words, does being at home versus being away actually help you win games? Now, the short and conclusive answer to that question is yes. And there are a variety of statistical tests that you can conduct to reach this conclusion. One of the tests you can conduct is looking at the 70 seasons of NBA basketball since 1946, when the NBA was first created. So let's first assume as our hypothesis that, in fact, there is no home court advantage. Well, then you'd expect the win percentage of all home teams in home games in a season to be 50% overall. Some seasons that number would be higher, but also some seasons that number would be lower, all due to statistical variance. But in all 70 seasons, the home teams always have a higher than 50% win rate, all 70 seasons. Again, if we're operating under the assumption that home court advantage doesn't exist, then our hypothesis would be that the probability of home teams having won more games than away teams in any given season is pretty much 50%. And the reverse should also have a 50% chance of happening. It should be 50% in 1946, it should be 50% in 1947, and it should be 50% in 2017. So the statistical odds of home teams having a better record than away teams for 70 straight years, if we operate under the assumption that there is no difference, the probability would then be 0.5 to the power of 70, which is a number that is very, very small or basically zero. And thus we reject our initial hypothesis that home teams do not have an advantage, and we conclude that there is a significant difference between home versus away teams throughout NBA history. Now, the test I just conducted operates under a couple of assumptions, and I chose it because it's a little bit easier to understand. For my fellow mathematicians out there, there have been tens of thousands of NBA games played throughout history. You can conduct a simple confidence interval, or you could also do some sort of two sample difference between means or difference between proportions test. You'd get the same result. So as far as whether or not there actually is home court advantage in the NBA within individual seasons or all across NBA history, there's zero debate surrounding that topic. There is home court advantage. But that prompts two further questions. Number one, to what extent does home court advantage exist? And number two, why does home court advantage exist? What is it about being at home that helps a team win games? Now let's try and answer the first question. While it's impossible to put any definitive number or percentage and say this is how much advantage teams have because statistical variance exists, there are some interesting things we can look at. Back in 2015, Tom Haberstroh of ESPN did an in-depth study on the decline of home court advantage season by season throughout NBA history and plotted a graph to show everyone this trend. Now, a couple things to note. Number one, he did this study about midway through the 2014-2015 season, and thus the win percentage of 53.7% actually ended up being around 56% for the whole season. But nonetheless, it was still the lowest in NBA history. And number two, in the article, Haberstroh specifies that this downward trend is also proven to be mathematically significant. And this leads us to our second question of what exactly it is about home court advantage that makes it advantageous. Is it the crowd distracting the away team and pumping up their own team? Is it the referees favoring the home team? Is it traveling and how that takes a toll on the away team players? Is it being more familiar with the arena, the court, the baskets? What is it? Well, the answer to what makes home court advantageous is probably some combination of those factors, but most noticeably there is one factor that people have studied quite extensively, and that's the effect on referees being biased towards home teams, or in other words, home cooking. One of Tom Haberstroh's theoretical explanations for why there has been a decline in home court advantage is that teams are now shooting more threes, and because of that, the game is now less dependent on referees than before. Intuitively, it makes sense. More NBA fouls happen in the paint and inside the three-point line than they do outside the three-point line. And if we look at a basic stat comparing the average number of three-point attempts and free throw attempts from 2005 to 2015, it suggests a correlation between increased three-point attempts and decreased free throw attempts. However, correlation does not imply causation. This is a big principle that's applied across many academic disciplines, and just because two things are correlated doesn't mean you can prove one thing causes another. For example, just because there is a correlation between how much cheese you eat versus how likely you are to die from bedsheet entanglement doesn't mean that eating cheese is causing people to suffocate themselves using their own bedsheets. And by the way, that is actually a real graph. Correlation can get pretty crazy sometimes. So back to home court advantage. After Haberstroh published this piece in 2015, Bernard Kent of the Harvard Sports Analysis Collective did a more comprehensive study on this correlation. After plotting a more detailed graph showing the decline in home court advantage for all 30 teams and the increase in three-point attempts, he combined the two graphs into a regression model, which proves a statistically significant correlation between the two, which suggests that increased three-point attempts at least partially contribute to the decrease in home court advantage, either directly or indirectly. But there's another problem that presents, and it's that we can't actually prove that it's the ref's fault for away teams performing poorly. We can't even conclude that it's the ref's fault for away teams getting called more fouls on average. What if that's because away teams get more nervous and they just make more mistakes? They have a harder time concentrating. There's no statistical evidence to say that it's the refs that are being biased towards the home team that is causing this home court advantage. Or is there? Pretty recently, Oliver Roeder of 538 wrote a piece talking about home court advantage in sports, and he focused on talking about the NBA, since it clearly has the most obvious home court advantage out of any major American sports league, as shown by this graph. And he brings up what is, quite frankly, I think, the only objective and scientific way to determine if there really is refereeing bias for home teams, and that is utilizing the NBA's 2-minute report. For those of you who might not be familiar, the NBA's 2-minute report was introduced in March of 2015, and it required the NBA league office to post their official reviews on any mistakes the refs made during the final 2 minutes of all games within 5 points. So if we take all the 2-minute reports from every game ever played since March of 2015, when the 2-minute report was first introduced, to the making of this video, which is November 2017, we can look at exactly how many incorrect calls went against the away team versus the home team. Now, essentially, there are two categories of mistakes a referee can make. One is an incorrect no call, where there was a foul or infraction, but the refs didn't call it. The second type of mistake, which is less common, is an incorrect call, where they called a foul or infraction, but in fact there wasn't one. When we take a look at the difference between incorrect no calls for home teams versus away teams, up to this point, there has actually been more incorrect no calls benefiting the away team than there have been benefiting home teams. But the difference is practically negligible. You're talking about a roughly 0.8% difference. But for incorrect calls, the relationship is a bit more significant, although the sample size is much smaller. There have been 95 incorrect calls benefiting the home team versus 76 benefiting the away team. I think it's also worth noting, however, that the number of incorrect calls as compared to correct calls is still a lot smaller. There have been more than 4,000 correct foul calls as compared to 171 total incorrect calls. Again, this 2-minute report thing has only existed for about 2 to 3 years. As we play more NBA seasons and we get more 2-minute reports and we get more data, then we'll start to see whether or not there actually is a refereeing bias towards away teams. All in all, home court advantage is a complicated phenomenon. The latter half of this video touched upon only one potential reason for why it exists. There are many other factors that could also contribute to it. My question for you watching this video right now is, what do you think is the biggest reason for the home court advantage phenomenon? Is it the refs? Is it the crowd and the audience's effect? Is it travel? Is it something psychological with the away team players or the home team players? Is it something very specific like the different colored courts and baskets and arenas? No need for any complicated research. I'm just curious as to what your intuitive guess is as to why home court advantage exists, especially in the NBA as compared to the other sports leagues. Let me know down in the comment section below. Also guys, I'll link all the articles and data sets and everything I used to make this video down in the description below, and I highly recommend you go check them all out to get a more in-depth understanding of it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you found this helpful or informative, make sure to just click that like button. This tells the YouTube algorithm that they should show this video to more people. If you want to discuss this particular topic with me directly, just feel free to message me on either Twitter or Instagram and we can talk about this. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. My name is Mark, aka MDJ, and I'll see you next time.